So I thought I'd let you guys tag along with me here today. Decided to come out for a walk. I'm really grateful to be back in Red Deer. You know, it's nice being in southern Alberta. Everything's so much warmer, but I mean, you just can't beat this, being in the Great White North. It's one of the best things about being Canadian. But I thought I'd share with you guys, you know, I've been working so hard with Enlighten University and, you know, going over the lessons for the students. But there's something that we started to talk about here with our Lecture 6 series that I wanted to share with you guys. And really for me, it has a lot to do with this river right here, the Red Deer River. And has to do with some work I did with what would be called sympathetic magic. And this is something, you know, whenever you use the word magic, you know, people, they'll look kind of contemptuously towards whatever it is you have to say, because it's seen as goofy or weird or, you know, fringe, whatever you may say about that. But one of the things that we've noted in looking at so many different cultures all around the world, doesn't matter, you know, if you talk about early Israelites in the Old Testament or Norse pagans or Egyptians or Greeks, you know, they all have this notion of sympathetic magic. And what is sympathetic magic? Sympathetic magic is basically the idea that when you do something symbolically, it can have an effect on the world around you. Really, almost all religious ritual is in some sense sympathetic magic. When we say certain words or we create certain works of art, we create an impression on the world, and this can extend out and cause a kind of influence. In my own case, I decided to use some kind of symbolic form of prayer. This is another way to think of it. You could think of it as a symbolic form of prayer. When I ended up losing a certain relationship, you know, I broke up with an ex, and I was really, really invested into that relationship. In fact, we had plans on getting married, and I was really distraught over the fact that it was all over, that it was all done. But I knew that there was nothing I could do to change it. That's just the way that it is, right? And so I took some things that I felt were symbolically meaningful to me, things that she had left with me, little possessions, little, you know, trinkets, knickknacks, whatever the case may be, and I put these all into a bag. And then in that bag, I also placed a rune stone, which represented new beginnings, new birth. And then I took all of this down to the river here, and I wrote out a simple prayer. I wrote out a prayer that essentially explained that I was hoping that by investing these things into the spirit world, by passing these little gifts of life into the spirit world, I would in some sense reap a harvest of a new relationship. And I even put a little ring in the bag in the hopes that this would create an impression leading to marriage. So I took all these little objects, I put them in this bag, I brought it down to the river with the prayer inside, and I threw the bag into the water. And in most cultures, in most traditions, in most societies, it's understood that there are really two major ways that you can spiritualize an object. You can pass it into the water, under the surface of the water, and it will thereby pass into the spirit world, or you can burn it, and thereby it ascends up into the sky, and thereby enters the spirit world. So this is really two ways that an object can be spiritualized. You see this in the case of baptism, where people go below the surface of the water, or in the case of a burnt offering, a sacrifice, or incense, in which case things go up into the heavens. And so I took it down to the river, I said a prayer, I threw it into the river, and it was only a few weeks later that I met Sora, my wife. And, you know, I've always looked at this as an extraordinary example of how sympathetic magic can work. When we take things that are symbolically meaningful, especially if they're symbolically meaningful to us in a very personal way, it can carry a form of potency. And these outward symbolic actions of physically going into a space, coming into the woods, coming into a sacred space where you're close to the powers of nature, close to the powers of the unconscious mind, you can gain access to sources of potency and power. And this is really significant. Really, you know, the reason we talked about this in our Lecture 6 series in Enlighten University was because in the ancient Egyptian understanding, right, the hieroglyphs themselves were seen as carrying a tremendous amount of potency. They were incredibly powerful. I should mention as well that our course that teaches on how to read and write in Egyptian hieroglyphs is available to the public, so anyone can go and check that out. Of course, it's a very short course. It's only meant as a very vague introduction, but I wanted to make it available to all of you guys. But I just wanted to share this story because I think oftentimes we feel that there's no magic left in the world, that there's no potency, there's no supernatural, right? And that we don't have access to it, but that's simply not the case. The supernatural is all around us. It infuses the natural world that we live in. And it's really important to understand that the fundamental difference between the science of magic and the science of materialism, the science of science, you might say, is that science itself is built on the notion of causation. X causes Y and Y causes Z, right? It's like dominoes. You can trace the line of dominoes back and you can come to conclusions about the material world using that method. But magic thinking or religious thinking or spiritual thinking is completely different. It's not the science of what causes what, it's the science of what likes to occur with what. It's what likes to happen in conjunction with what. You know, a good example of this, Carl Gustav Jung was a tremendously intelligent academic, very sophisticated, but he had an appreciation for astrology. And he said the reason is because it's a classic example of a synchronicity, a situation where seemingly unrelated objects occur in similar time. So in other words, the alignments of the planets obviously have no material cause on what's happening in the world around us, right? The position of Jupiter relative to the background stars doesn't have any material effect on Earth, and if it did, it'd be very, very subtle. But nonetheless, it's symbolically meaningful.
Dr. Jung put forward a new concept that he called synchronicity. This term means a meaningful coincidence of outer and inner events that are not themselves causally connected. The emphasis lies on the word meaningful. If an aircraft crashes before my eyes as I am blowing my nose, this is a coincidence of events that has no meaning. It is simply a chance occurrence of a kind that happens all the time. But if I bought a blue frock and by mistake the shop delivered a black one on the day one of my near relatives died, this would be a meaningful coincidence. The two events are not causally related, but they are connected by the symbolic meaning that our society gives to the color black.
I've had so many experiences with these, in fact, it's too many to number, right? But when we talk about sympathetic magic, we're really talking about Jungian synchronicities in reverse. It's where we do something meaningful in the world around us, and it seems to cause some kind of a supernatural result, or it influences things in the material world that we haven't otherwise touched or interacted with. One of the things I've been thinking on quite a bit recently, is the significance of grave offerings. Archaeologists usually find all of their most important discoveries in the form of grave offerings, right? You look at the tomb of Tutankhamun and, different burial offerings from India, China, all around the world. This is usually what archaeologists look for. But the sad thing is that, in the future, there really won't be any grave offerings to go along with our culture, right? We don't bury anything with our dead, and we certainly don't afford them the great symbolic mausoleums that people in the past used to. Because in the ancient world it was understood that these graves, these tombs, these temples were really understood to be the house of the dead. And by burying things into the tomb, it was in some sense sending those things into the spirit world. And when I look at my own experiences, these experiences that I've had using simple forms of symbolic prayer or sympathetic magic, you have these experiences and you think maybe they were onto something, maybe they understood something that we've lost or that we've forgotten. Namely, the importance of ceremony, the importance of ritual, the importance of taking advantage of the material objects around us in order to have a real impact on the spirit world. And this in turn can seem to affect the material world, which is surprising. It's almost hard to believe. I know some people, they may hear about this kind of talk of sympathetic magic or symbolic prayer, and they may scoff and they say, oh, that's all witchcraft, But if you look in the Bible, it's so clear and obvious that these things were employed by the Israelites. My favorite example is in the book of Numbers, where Moses instructs the Israelites that when a woman is suspected of committing adultery, the Israelites are to write these spells on a papyrus scroll and then wash the spells off into a jar of water. And then the woman suspected of committing adultery is intended to drink the water, and if she has in fact committed adultery, the spell will affect her. It will make her sick. And this is all laid out in the book of Numbers, and in fact this is an Egyptian form of magic. You can actually find Egyptian spells that prescribe exactly these things. They tell the initiate to write a story or write a spell on a scroll, wash it off into a jar of water, and then consume it. And this is used to cause harm and good as well. So you may say, well, that's all evil, that's all witchcraft. Well, then why is it in the Bible, right? And if you use the Bible to justify that kind of an ethic, well, then you've got a bit of a situation, right? I think that in many ways there's a lot of benefit to coming out into nature, to being alone with the natural world like this, because it gives you a real opportunity to just be close to the forces of nature and to really appreciate the natural wonder of it all. And, I even hesitate bringing a camera because, even talking into a camera and thinking in terms of you guys being here with me today, it can sully the rawness of the experience of being alone in the wild. Even being alone, it brings with itself a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of nervousness. You're like an animal in the woods, and you're always looking around, right? And it's instinct, right? It evokes within you this very primal sense of who and what you are. And in many ways, this is what religion does. It's meant to bring us into touch with this primal aspect of ourselves, with the root of who we are. I just had somebody email me today and ask me about the nature of enlightenment, and asking me if I had an experience of enlightenment or what exactly it was. And it really occurred to me that one of the best ways I could describe my experience or my understanding of it is that enlightenment is what arises when you've given up all hope of achieving something. It's so ironic in many ways how you go through this spiritual process and you're trying to accomplish something, you're trying to achieve something, and it's this great edifice, it's this great thing that you're reaching for. But in the process of venturing into the spirit world and coming face to face with death, you're almost filled with a tremendous sense of despair, a tremendous sense of hopelessness. And you say to yourself, it's not worth it. There's nothing about this life that's lasting, nothing that can be grasped, nothing that can be held onto. And the hopelessness of that experience drives you deeper and deeper into the unconscious, almost in a form of a suicidal attempt of trying to snuff out the life, to escape the perpetual suffering of existence. And when you go into that space within yourself, you venture deeper and deeper until eventually you reach the void, you become one with the void, and then you remember who and what you really are. And you realize that you were that truth all along, and that the truth was self-evident and all around you. It's really like diving into the sea. Enlightenment is not what happens when you become an expert swimmer. Enlightenment is more so what happens when you become an expert diver and you have no intention of coming up again for another breath of air. You may say that's horrifying or that's suicidal, it's crazy, and it is. To really reach a full experience of spiritual awakening, you have to be in a place where you're really anxious to lose it all. You want to give it all up. You want out. And it's in that moment when you really want out more than anything that you remember that it's all just fine, because the next day comes. You wake up, you come up out of the void, and you've seen the white light, you've seen the mind of God, and you know that it was always peace, that peace was always all around you.